Legendary doctor's secret history leaves his colleagues in total awe. When Dr. James Barry met with a patient, they could breathe a sigh of relief. There were few professionals in the field with the medical knowledge and life-saving expertise of the doc. But while he knew his way around every disease, affliction, and amputation saw, the brash and bawdy physician was a mystery to everyone he diagnosed. He had a long hidden background that no one on the planet knew, until he died. Then, decades of secrets finally started pouring out. A difficult man. Even his rivals would agree Dr. James Barry knew his stuff. They hated to admit it, mostly because Dr. Barry was a bit obnoxious to be around, if you weren't a patient relying on his treatment. But he completely revolutionized 19th century medicine, and one feature he developed truly stands out: historical success. Before Dr. Barry changed the game, C-section births were only done after the mother and possibly the child had passed. He became the first surgeon to conduct the procedure with no deaths. Dr. James Barry was a master surgeon, and throughout his life, work remained at the forefront of his character. On the surface, as a member of the British military, Dr. James Barry made a huge impact on the lives of those who needed him, regardless of skin color or economic status. But he was odd. Associates as far back as medical school took notice of some of his odd personality traits, struggling with distance. The soft-speaking Dr. Barry was very self-conscious about his appearance. Colleagues noticed he kept his face finely trimmed, never letting a beard show, and he was also terribly short and very self-conscious about it. His rough temper and distant behavior was also a concern, as was his relationship with women. Unfavorable. See, Dr. Barry was known to be a terrible brute. Even Florence Nightingale, the legendary nurse who made monumental impacts in patient care and sure professionalism, thought so. The two didn't care for one another, and certain behaviors of Dr. B's really stood out to the mother of modern medicine. Terrible personality. Notably, Dr. Barry was especially difficult with women. He could be hostile towards the women in his life, but he was also an insatiable flirt despite never taking a wife or courting a colleague. In modern terms, Dr. James Barry was an utter dog, at least until the patients showed up. Patient to patient. Fortunately, patients never dealt with Dr. Barry's wrath. With them, he was kind and caring. He traveled across the world, going from the UK to Africa to Venezuela and lastly, Canada, as assigned by his military superiors. Dr. James Barry was changing the world around him, but the world was changing him too. Out sick. Dr. Barry couldn't adjust to the Canadian weather and climate and wound up sick with bronchitis. After making positive changes to soldiers' housing and nutrition along with their families, the doctor was sent back to London to recuperate. Sadly, this would lead to his end, unplanned retirement. While Dr. Barry wanted to return to the war efforts as a doctor, his superiors would not allow it. Over the next few years, old age took over, and the widespread disease of dysentery took Dr. James Barry's life. His story, however, was just getting started. A final request. See, at the end of his life, Dr. Barry had a simple request. When he died, there would be no examination. There would be no formal change into funeral attire. He wanted to be buried 6 feet under right away without a second glance. His maid, however, had different plans. The truth uncovered. When the maid undressed Dr. Barry, she saw a woman's body laying on the table in front of her. The maid's mind started reeling with 1,000 possibilities. Was this the real Dr. Barry? It couldn't be. He had been such a flirt, a womanizer. The medical community was stunned. People started digging into Barry's past. The unknown beginning. The story went like this. When Dr. James Barry was born in 1789 Ireland, they were biologically a baby girl named Margaret Bulkley. Her family struggled financially as her father was in debt, which he was eventually imprisoned for. Then the eldest boy, John Bulkley, disappeared. Margaret and their mother had to find a way through it. A man's help. After some deliberation, the duo decided the only option was to rely on Margaret's uncle, James Barry, who was a painter and professor at the Royal Academy of Arts in London. Sadly, he refused to help, but life has a funny way of working out. A new beginning. The real James Barry passed away from respiratory illness in 1806, leaving no will to anyone in particular. The stray Bulkleys were given some of his estate, which helped them along for a bit, but wouldn't forever. Still, Margaret had resources now, and with help from the late James Barry's friends, the future doctor started training. Woman's work. Originally, Margaret was being trained as a tutor and governess, common jobs for women back then. But the future doctor would show a great talent for learning at the young age of 17. Two connections changed their path. Rising genius. Under the tutelage of Dr. Edward Fryer, Margaret was introduced to the study of medicine. On the side, Margaret tutored the son of General Francisco Miranda, a revolutionary working to liberate his native home of Venezuela. Everyone took notice of Margaret's intelligence and hoped to foster it. Fast learning. General Miranda welcomed the young scholar into his vast library, where they learned everything they could. All of them, including Margaret's mother, knew how brilliant the child was and how much potential they possessed. However, she worried. She knew there was one problem Margaret couldn't overcome: a new identity. It's no secret how much a woman's life was restricted throughout history, so the family concocted a plan. Margaret Bulkley would be no more, and from then on, Margaret wore the name of James Barry and entered medical school. Everyone involved was held to secrecy, but that didn't make things any easier. To be man. Margaret Bulkley changed into James Barry and stood as other men did, in dress and attitude, but there were some things that couldn't, at the time, be concealed. Without the right hormones, the young James Barry was missing two rather noticeable things: a man's voice and facial hair. This led to unexpected complications. Becoming Dr. Barry. In spite of James's excellent grades studying medicine, the university would not allow him to graduate because they suspected he was too young. It was thanks to another connection from Uncle James that Dr. James Barry was allowed to graduate. Others pitched in to hide the truth, with another doctor certifying Dr. Barry was a man. Not everything went according to plan, however. Change in plan. Because the new Dr. James Barry planned to follow their dear friend, General Miranda, to Venezuela, where women were free to practice medicine. The general was betrayed and imprisoned until he died in 1816, leaving Barry with few options. He chose to remain as a man, and more importantly, one incredible doctor. Expression of why. To this day, people speculate why Dr. James Barry kept his background private. Some state the obvious, because a woman wouldn't be taken seriously in the medical field. The doctor had no choice. Others believe there was something deeper at play, a trans man living in the wrong era.